Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Diane Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Today is December 20th, 2023, and we have finally reached the season finale for season 2, and have we got a show for you. It is absolutely amazing. But before we get to our interview guest, I just have to tell you, this season has been absolutely just amazing. I am so shocked how this podcast has really taken off. When I first started last year, it was quite a while before I really found my voice in the podcast. It started out just as a podcast version of my Whatever Wednesday blogs that I was doing, and very quickly changed because I realized that format was not really beneficial. There was nothing important that I had to say in the beginning episodes. I was really flailing trying to find my voice. But then when I did, and I changed it to Book Banter with Diane Burkhart and made it a book talk podcast where I interviewed other authors and industry professionals to help authors to improve their work and their presence online, it really took off. I started receiving messages from publicists who wanted to bring me their authors, and I started talking with some of the most incredible people, from indie authors to hybrid authors to traditionally published authors and industry professionals who actually work as publicists and editors and marketers. And it has just been amazing. I have learned so much from talking to all these people, improving my own work as an author and podcaster, and putting out the Book Banter magazine. I have just been able to connect with so many fantastic people in this industry, and all of the readers who are following, who are interested in what these authors have to say. It's just been such a blessing. And so I want to thank all of you. Please, if you have enjoyed this podcast, subscribe, tell your friends, share the posts, follow us on our social media, because we have got more fantastic things coming, and we are only going to keep growing. So watch out for things that are coming up. We are getting ready to go on our holiday hiatus for the next few weeks. We start up again February 7th in 2024. That will be the beginning of season 3. We have got a new issue of Book Banter magazine coming out on the 1st of February. And it's going to all be about love, of course, for February. But it's going to be about loving yourself and loving others. And of course, we're going to have some great romance authors, but also some self-help about how to find your way and maybe untangle the things that have been plaguing your life up till now. So it's going to be a great issue. And of course, I'm going to be finding a fantastic cookbook author to add to the mix so that we can bring you a great recipe for Valentine's Day. And while we're on hiatus, we will be having our 100th episode for Book Banter with Diane Burkhart, and we're going to come back for a new episode for that one. And I'm going to have a very special guest who I am not going to announce ahead of time. You're just going to have to tune in and check out that episode to find out who's going to be joining me to celebrate 100 episodes. So keep following us on our social media. We have a brand new Facebook page at dianeburkhart.author, which covers all of the Book Banter information for our podcast and our magazine. So follow us there, and you can keep up to date on everything that is coming out for Book Banter with Diane Burkhart podcast and magazine. We've got some more things coming up at the end of the interview today that I will tell you about. But for right now, let's bring out this amazing guest. Oh my God, I have to say, she is probably the most surprising author that I have spoken to this entire season. Because frankly, she writes in a genre that I am not prone to buy these books. She has a memoir out called Private Public, My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater. And it's all about her life meeting Joe Papp, who created the Public Theater in New York City, was responsible for bringing free Shakespeare in the Park to the masses, and fought New York to make sure that it stayed free, and how the things that they were doing there at the Public Theater really brought to life some fantastic careers for actors and directors and choreographers and musicians. And it actually had some significant global reach. There are things that I enjoyed in my life as a child in Kansas because of what they did in New York City at their theater. And it was just amazing reading her book, how I identified with so many of the things that she mentioned that they were responsible for bringing into my life, that I recognize these things and I grew up with them. And it just made that book so personal for me as I read it. And getting to speak with her about it was just beyond a blessing. She is a fabulous person, so down to earth, wonderful to talk to. You're going to love this interview. So now that's enough blather for the moment. Please welcome to Book Banter with Diane Burkhart, Gail Merrifield Papp. Go ahead and tell our listeners who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Gail Merrifield Papp. I'm very happy to be on this program with the remarkable Diane Burkhart. And I'm here because at a rather advanced age, I've written my first book, which is called Public-Private, My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater. Now, the Public Theater is in New York City.
So why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the Public Theater?
It was founded on an early stage of doing Shakespeare's plays in New York City's parks for free in a 2,000-seat amphitheater where no one paid per ticket. It's been going strong for well over 60 years now, and it's still free. So it had a democratic base that was founded by my husband, Joe Papp, because he believed in a free access to culture and felt it had been denied to many people in New York City, and he wanted to make it available. So later on, he developed the idea of doing new American plays as well as free Shakespeare. And that's when I came aboard in 1965, way back.
So what was your first job with the Public Theater?
I was hired, first of all, to work in the outdoor Shakespeare theater. And then Joe developed the idea of a public theater devoted to new American work that would be open to everyone, which was not necessarily the case back in the 60s. There were various ethnic groups and also gender considerations that had effectively excluded people from being active in the theater, for which they had tremendous talent.
I know from reading your book that Joe was very active in anti-discrimination throughout his career. So how did he respond to this in the community?
So he just opened the doors and established a theatrical complex called the Public Theater in New York City, in Greenwich Village. And I just happened to have arrived in my job at that very moment. So I was employed there, curating and developing new works, as well as musicals. The first 25 years of its history was an amazing time. And in writing this book, I wanted to bring to life the people, plays, and politics of that era, especially because nowadays the theater is under tremendous difficulties across the country, big, little, and theaters alike in this post-pandemic phase of our history are having tremendous difficulties surviving.
What kind of challenges are the theaters dealing with?
They've lost audiences, they've lost sponsorship, and they've lost ticket sales, the diminishing of audience attendance, and many problems that everyone is trying to solve. So I thought possibly in writing this book, I could make that history that I knew relevant to the situation today, both in terms of theater and I guess by reference in some ways in general to people, especially young people, who are trying to find solutions to some very difficult situations, both personal and professional, that they find themselves in. How do you go about that? What do you do? In my 25 years with Joe as his partner in the theater, I saw how he handled certain situations, and I thought that would be interesting and hopefully helpful to people today and how they go about dealing with really tremendously difficult problems that they need to solve.
It seems like from reading your book that both you and Joe were very passionate about always helping other people. What do you think it was that really drove Joe's passion in creating the public theater?
The interesting thing about this theater in New York City is that due to Joe's background, he came out of a very poor, impoverished background of immigrant parents in Brooklyn, but he was naturally talented. He had a natural, tremendous interest in language and the sound of speeches from an early age. He was quite precocious, and there was nothing around him that particularly encouraged that. He just had it. So he went about founding a theater without any support. He had no money. He had no major donors. There was absolutely no influential sources behind what he wanted to do. He had his own passion for bringing certain things to people who didn't have access to them in the city. And he went about it in the only way he knew, which was by talking. And he was a very good talker. He was a very well expressed person. He had an interesting presence. He was a very real kind of person. There was nothing theoretical or removed about him. He was always very accessible, always very, very passionate about what he was trying to do, and remarkably devoted to the welfare of the city that he lived in. So it was a democratic idea that he started out with, first with free admission and then with free access for all writers, composers, and other people, actors in the theater. And it has attracted now 3 generations of audiences, actors and playwrights and other people involved in the theater who have sort of inherited this DNA of his democratic idea.
What do you think was Joe's inspiration for his democratic idea for the theater?
I remember when I first heard Joe talking about it, I'd just been hired at the festival for my kind of summer temporary job, taking his notes as a director of the outdoor Shakespeare theater. And he, at that time, had compared the free access in the parks to Shakespeare to the free access we all have to books you can borrow from the library. And that really hit home with me because when I was growing up at the tail end of the Depression in Berkeley, California, my parents never had money to buy books at a bookstore. I'd never been at a bookstore in my life until I was an adult. The only way I could read a book, since I certainly couldn't buy one, nor could they, was to go with my parents to Berkeley, California's public library. And we would each borrow books there. We'd leave the library with 3 stacks of books for myself, my mother, and my father. And it was just a very exciting time. We'd go home, be able to read them. That's how I read books during my childhood. So Joe's words about the public library back then really hit home with me. It rang bells of freedom and access that I immediately understood.
Why was it so important for Joe to have the public on his side to support this idea of the freedom of access to theater?
Because he was having to battle an influencer in New York City at that time who happened to be also a drama critic for a very powerful newspaper called the New York Herald Tribune. And this guy had been opposed to Joe's idea of free access, which, by the way, was also opposed by a very powerful guy named Robert Moses, who was like a super boss in the city back then. And he thought that Joe should charge admission in the parks. And since Joe wouldn't do that to offset certain costs, or was willing to raise the money to offset that cost, he didn't want to do it by charging admission. So he got banned from the parks on that account.
That's incredible. I can't imagine how difficult it was for him to battle against that.
Isn't that amazing? He had tremendous public support. This is a wonderful blessing to the city. People loved to come to these outdoor Shakespeare plays, which were professionally cast. They were free to present, admission free to people. They weren't free to do. You had to raise money to do them, of course. But so Joe wrote this wonderful piece that I read way back when I first started, where he argued that in a city the size of New York, he felt that it was an important thing. And this powerful influencer had said, quote, he's against free Shakespeare because it encourages wholesale freeloading. A man must pay for what he gets. If he doesn't, there's something wrong with him or something wrong with it, close quote. So Joe was outraged. He fired off this marvelous answer to it, which got printed, a very vigorous rebuttal where he compared his idea of free access to Shakespeare in the parks to the public library. It read like a manifesto that I immediately understood because he wrote, quote, in a city the size of New York, it is of the utmost importance to have a public theater, a theater for everybody. Yes, everybody, for those who can afford it and for those who cannot, close quote. So that kind of idea, which is a democratic idea after all, it became embedded in the DNA, I think, of the organization. And it exists to this very moment under its current leadership of Oscar Eustis. And everybody who works there somehow either absorbs it, understands it, or has possibly encountered it still because they're actors who are still very much in the profession who worked with Joe back then.
I know there was quite an impressive list of people who worked with Joe back when he was starting up the public theater. Can you tell us who some of those people are who are still around in the entertainment business? Who would we know?
People like Mandy Patinkin, Kevin Kline, Meryl Streep, they all got their early start with Joe at the public theater. Also, James Earl Jones was stalwart of the early theater that Joe started. They all started out in Shakespeare and when they were quite young. And they all remember that experience. And they went on and did other things for Joe as well as elsewhere. And they remember that remarkable passion based on a democratic idea in the theater that somehow became a tradition, hallmark, and the DNA of the organization. So I thought I would try to communicate a little bit of that. I'm fascinated to see how it still goes on because it tells me that in an idea that can be extremely powerful. And I have this example of it in my own life. We also have an example of it in the country, I think, because as someone once said recently, we're the only country founded on an idea, which is the idea expressed in the Constitution. Other countries don't have something similar to that. They found it on different things. But we have this idea expressed in the Constitution. So Joe was an interesting patriot because he didn't see any separation between his artistic mission in the theater, which was to produce plays of some meaning for people, and his social responsibility. They were totally fused, one and the same thing. They were not separate items. That's just the way he was, the way he'd grown up, and the way he developed as a young man. So I was trying to convey some of this in the book that I wrote. I've been very gratified by its response so far. People seem to catch on that although it's certainly my personal story, and people call this a love story, a life story, whatever, people caught on that it's not just for people interested in the theater. It's really for anybody who has a dream about making something that didn't exist, who has passion and ethics and believes in an idea bigger than themselves. I've tried to dramatize that, I guess you use that word about it, in terms of various incidents and experiences that Joe and I had together in our work together and how that evolved and what I learned and wanted to communicate to others about it. I've been pleased at some aspect of that.
I can tell you that I would definitely say that this book would reach anybody, no matter what their interests are. I mean, because I'll be perfectly honest here. This is not a book that I would have looked for going into a bookstore. Mm-hmm. It's not the things that I usually typically read just for entertainment. But I am so thankful that your publicist contacted me about this, because once I started reading your book, I could not stop. I would sit at our training pages going, oh my God, that's amazing. Oh my God. I mean, just constantly through the whole book, it was absolutely fascinating. And while I have, dabbled a little bit in theater when I was in like high school and college, and I have a lot of friends who are in theater, it's not a focus of my life. I don't read things about the theater, but this has so many more far reaching elements to it beyond that, that I think that it would appeal to anybody who is just fascinated with how things get done in the United States, how people achieve their dreams. It is absolutely amazing. And one point that I definitely think should not be glossed over is your achievements at this time period, because you were a professional businesswoman in a career field that was not typically welcoming to women.
Oh, no, not
at
at all.
A time when women couldn't even have a credit card in their own name.
Oh, no, not at all. That's right. That's right. You remember that, or you know of it.
It's like, how could you even go and rent an apartment on your own when you can't sign for things as a woman at that time period?
That's right. I'm just sort of amazed that I was alive in that era. It seems so remote in so many ways, but then, of course, it's not that remote at all. But I used to think in terms of these things, oh, my God, my grandmothers weren't allowed to vote.
Mm-hmm.
That's just amazing. My grandmother's, one of them was a very fine writer. The other one taught in a junior college, and they weren't allowed to vote. I thought, gee whiz. And I knew these grandmothers. I thought, this is just amazing. How could that happen with anything that I would know of in my lifetime? But it did happen. And, for most of their adult life, they were not allowed to vote. And then there were all these other kind of restrictions that came along. Like, I write about this in the book a little bit. When job ads in the New York Times were segregated by sex.
Mm-hmm.
So there was help wanted under male and help wanted female. And if you were female, you couldn't apply for those jobs in the male column. Or if you did, you would be immediately disqualified on site, which I was when I applied for a job in the male column because it was a trainee job in editorial work. I was a very young girl. I was interested in getting trainee work. But when I entered the personnel manager's office, he saw me. I got rejected on sight because I wasn't M for male. I was F for female. So that's the way it was back then. And I remember being outraged by it and didn't know what the hell to do about it at that time. It was the very beginning of the women's liberation movement. So my consciousness needed some little further elevation before I understood who I could connect with to try to express some of my own personal frustrations about that sort of thing. And then, of course, that gives you a very solid basis to understand other groups of people who feel excluded by definition and on sight from opportunities that should be open to them. So I feel a very strong identification in that respect with all people who experience that kind of terrible prejudice and continue to deal with it today. And I'm very, very sensitive to it.
You and Joe actually did a lot to help marginalized people during the career that you two had together, bringing Black American playwrights to the stage and female playwrights, and bringing people who are different sexual orientations.
Absolutely.
And bringing all of these people to opportunities that they would not have had, especially at that time period.
Right. The only criterion that Joe ever had, and certainly that I ever had, was talent. I mean, if you have the talent, or you be an actor, a playwright, a musician, a composer, writer, whatever your profession might be, what was the talent and the skill that you had to offer? And maybe you had a certain kind of talent that Joe himself was very receptive to, which was a potential. You had a potential talent. And he was remarkably astute in sensing that in a person. So even someone without a whole bunch of credentials, say, that they could trot in front of him on a resume or whatever, he would sense the native intelligence and potential in a person and give them a break to get the skills and background they needed. That was a very rare quality that he had. He certainly had it. So many people were able to develop their native God-given talents because of that. Whereas in another kind of situation, they'd just be automatically excluded. And I think he connected because he himself was not a favored person in terms of his economic or social circumstances as he grew up. Quite the opposite. And he'd had to struggle to get employment, primarily in his teens, because he was Jewish. And he later on became very conscious of how that kind of prejudice applied to many different kinds of people, and he became their champion. This is true when he served in the Navy in the Second World War, and he saw the prejudice against certain kinds of black Navy men then, and he very readily enlisted himself in their defense when they protested. So all of that experience that he had certainly entered into his consciousness and purpose in the theater, which he was very, very passionate about. He was not a laid-back person. He was very vocal. He was also fun to be around. He was not a grim person at all, not at all grim. He simply was passionate, I think is the proper word I can use about Joe, in what he did. And unlike most people in life, he was directed by his passion to be useful and helpful to the people in the theater that he became associated with and that he attracted. He was truly unusual because he wasn't in the theater to make money. His title was producer, of course, but he wasn't producing plays, remarkably, in order to make money. He had to raise money to produce plays because operated a nonprofit theater means it doesn't make a profit very easily, at least, very seldom, unless one nonprofit play goes to Broadway, becomes a huge hit. That can happen. It happened to our theater a few times, but you can't bank on that whatsoever. You can't predict it. So he was never in it to make money. He was in it for another kind of reason entirely. People have asked me, they said, well, what was that reason then? What was it? He's a producer of plays. I said, well, I think he had a soul of an artist, for one thing. And the way he expressed it was through what he produced. So the production of a play or a musical was for him an extension of his own artistic gift. And he felt the fulfillment that he could experience through that had nothing to do with making money. Most of his plays never made a cent. People involved in them got paid properly. But as far as his own personal standing was concerned, he didn't make a penny from anything. And whatever proceeds came in from tickets or whatever went to the support of the theatrical institution, not to himself personally whatsoever. So most people really don't proceed in life in that capacity that he had with that particular take on what he wanted to do. But he was certainly an unusual and dynamic person in that respect. Although he wasn't perfect by any means, I'm not suggesting he was a perfect person. None of us are. I've never met a perfect person anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not a perfect person. Nobody I've ever met. None of my relatives are perfect, so forth and so on. But he made mistakes without question. There were things he had to learn in the hard way, I think. And he had a difficult personal background in many respects, but he was remarkably generous towards people that he was associated with. I mean, generous in spirit, very fair. I think one of the things I write about in the book, chapter called An Equal Opportunity Employer, where in my early days when I was first working for him as the assistant to the producer, he was looking at a report from his financial office, and he saw what my salary was, which was pretty low at that time. And he said he's going to raise me up to something else. I considered a huge sum of money in those days. And so I thanked him very profusely. But he spotted right away that my value needed to be translated into dollars in a better way in the list of salaries that he was looking at. So I appreciated that because it wasn't so common back then. If you had a useful employee that you valued and they weren't paid a hell of a lot, it usually just got left there, so what? You got a cheap employee, so that was okay. Joe was not like that. He immediately raised me very significantly in terms of dollars in those days. And I really appreciated that, especially considering, as you pointed out earlier, my background in this horrible era when girls and women were really prejudiced against in so many different ways. there's certainly a hangover. There will be for probably an indefinite period of history of that going on. It'll rise and fall probably in the future, but we all have a taste of it. And it's not specifically like it was back at, say, in the 50s when I was looking for jobs. It certainly comes up in attitudes towards women and girls these days. And I can pick up on that immediately when I sense it. I know when that happens. So he was not like that, which was an exceptional thing in a man back then in the 60s.
And to have that kind of a business relationship with your boss, that they actually appreciate you for your abilities, regardless of your sex.
Yes, he did.
Had to be a gift at that time period.
He did appreciate my abilities. He also helped me to develop them in the theater because I had rather insufficient background in the theater, quite frankly. I had very little experience, just limited kind of experience a little bit. He sensed that I was alert and hardworking. He used to say that I reminded him a little bit of his mother, who was an immigrant from Lithuania, who worked very hard as a dressmaker in sweatshops in New York City initially. And he remembered how she just was always toiling and striving in her jobs. So I don't know exactly what the analogy is, but I think something about the toiling and striving he sensed in me because I was a hard worker.
Well, I think one of the stories that you mentioned in the book would have really driven that home for him whenever there was a snowstorm in New York and you two were the only two who made it into the office, and you walked how many blocks to get there in the snowstorm?
It was about 57 or 60 blocks, I think I had to walk.
Yeah, that's incredible. Not a lot of people are that dedicated to their job.
Well, I know it was partly that. It's partly that I just, I didn't want to stay home, cooped up in my small apartment all day long. I liked my work. And I thought, well, at least there'll be exercise and I'll get there and can do something. And I didn't know there would be anybody there, but as it turned out, Joe was there. He was the only other person there when I finally arrived at that long walk through the snowstorm. But he was like that himself. He was a workaholic. I have a little of that trait myself. So he was surprised to see me, nevertheless, when I walked in. I was frosted with snow all over my face and a hood of my parka and so forth. He thought I looked like some kind of St. Bernard dog to rescue somebody lost in the snowbound Alps, by the time I arrived in the office. But he was an interesting person because he was so passionate and driven by what he wanted to accomplish that people had very different impressions of him. And I'm totally aware of that. They had different experiences with him. They perceived different aspects of him depending what those circumstances were. So, history is kind of written that way, I think, from different people's points of view. And it doesn't mean one point of view is necessarily the only one or the historically correct one. It means that they are all kind of Rashomon, like you get different angles on a situation and the people in it, depending on who's telling the story. So my story is a part of that fabric of history that one can piece together. There are two other very fine books I should mention, since this is a book site here. Mm-hmm. One is the first biography of Joe, which was published in the 1990s, shortly after he died, by Helen Epstein, called Joe Papp in American Life. It's a fully researched, I helped them research a little bit, fully researched kind of cultural biography of Joe. It's well worth reading and has a great deal of amplitude of detail of the culture, the broader scene at the time. It's a very, very fine book by a wonderful writer who is really responsible for the establishment of a consciousness of a second generation of children of Holocaust survivors. She established that with one of her first books. And the other one is a very different kind of book called Free for All, which Joe partly co-authored before he died by Kenneth Turan of the Los Angeles Times. And that comes out of an oral history, many different voices talking about the same event that are blended together in a fascinating account of different episodes of the theater's history. particularly of productions. It's very production-oriented. So if you want to get an interesting view of the dramatic circumstances around the evolution of certain productions at the Public Theater, that book is extremely entertaining and interesting, and you'll get a full account of everybody's very different and oftentimes petulant point of view about the same events and people that were involved. So that's another kind of book. They both have a wonderful place, I think, on the bookshelf. And mine is the first personal memoir to be written, and it has a different kind of approach entirely. I'm not interested in portraying a cultural fabric of the society in a biography. I certainly wasn't going to go about trying to duplicate what had already been done in an oral history with many different voices chiming in. It's just a different type of account of the history from a personal close-up that other people didn't happen to have. I think they all belonged together. If you want to read everything there is to read. There's another book that appeared much earlier called Enter Joe Papp, which was written early on in 1972 by a very fine journalist, which was just about 1 year in Joe's life, 1972. So if you want a blow-by-blow account of 1 year, you can get it in that one. If you have time to read all these things, that's fine. But if you don't, pick and choose. And I always have been very much drawn to personal memoirs. I read quite a few personal memoirs written by women who were either married to or the partners or the ex-partners of men that were prominent. There's some very fine ones. Norman Mailer's wife wrote one, so did several other people. I find those accounts really quite interesting. Some of them are really quite well written. Some of them come out of different kinds of motivations. Like one reason that some women have written this kind of memoir is for the sake of revenge.
Yeah.
After a lousy experience with someone. Well, okay, that's one kind of memoir. My memoir is not impelled by that whatsoever. But I can understand how a memoir can be impelled by that.
The one thing that I really enjoyed about your book is it's such a great blend of your personal history and how you became introduced to Joe's work and getting involved in the theater and going on with how you two actually came working together. Because there's so many little nuances through this whole thing that I think are important to the whole story. Like the fact that you actually come from a long line of theater people and you started out your career in publishing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now You're going from working in publishing to actually being published.
I can hardly believe it. I never thought I'd arrive at this point in my life. Although there are 5 generations of women in my family who were actors in the 19th century. My great aunt and aunt, also a great aunt, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother. They were all actresses.
That's amazing.
Starting in the 19th century. I've never had any ambition or talent for that whatsoever, but I've been certainly conscious of that heritage in the family. The whole family is conscious of it. And I have many of their letters and so forth, wonderful photographs of some of them and their roles. Also, I come out of a family of writers. Both my parents were writers. So I do have a rich background of these kinds of artistic people, particularly my parents, who had a intimate relationship that I'll call words. Mm. You have that as an actor, that relationship with words. You have it as a writer, a relationship with words. So I've always been very conscious of loving the use of words from the time I was a child. And I still have that. Joe had that also. He had an ear for the use of words because he grew up in a family where the primary language was Yiddish. That was his first language. And English was a second language. And he also grew up in a multicultural neighborhood in Brooklyn where there were people who spoke Spanish, Yiddish, Hebrew, and so forth. So he became fascinated by the different sounds of words and how they get sculpted by the language that you use for them. So we shared that from our different backgrounds. We certainly shared that love of the power, the sound, and the use of words, which is all about what theater is. You can't have theater without them. Oh, yes, you can. You can have pantomime and so forth. But spoken theater, yes, it's all about words.
Do you think that background helped you to do a better job as the director of new works at the Public Theater?
I think it must have helped me. But I think what helped me most of all, to be quite honest, was that I grew up not with television, not with movies, because we couldn't afford movies, but I grew up with radio. And I listened to Superman, books, The Great Gildersleeve, Let's Pretend on radio. I grew up with all of that constantly. And I listened to those shows every single day after I got home from school. So I developed a amazingly real kind of visual imagination through my ears. So later on, when I started to read plays, I found that the most useful organ that I had was not necessarily my eyes, but my ears. I could hear the intonation of characters in a play and vividly imagine what was going on. I think people that grew up with television, I remember talking to one director who grew up with television, and he had a tremendous visual sense, very wonderful visual sense of things, which he attributed to having grown up with television. I have a very visual sense of it, and it was because I grew up listening to stories. And that's how my imagination works, is through the ears somehow. So that's what I attribute my ability to make sense of a script. It was because of that, I think.
As the director of new works, was there ever anything that you passed on that later on you kind of like second guessed that you wish that you had brought to him?
Well, let me think. I'm sure there must have been something. There were plays that became very successful that my department might have passed on. I think there was one, I can't remember which one it was, and I felt duty bound to inform Joe that my department had passed on that particular play, but it wasn't something he would have produced anyhow. I kind of knew that. There are plays that I encountered elsewhere that I wished we had gotten onto in some fashion. I mentioned it in the book, there was this marvelous Byzantine musical that we heard in Russia. We didn't see it, but we heard it in Russia, called Juno and a Waltz. And it had this powerful score and a very powerful story. It was hugely successful. It went on to great celebrity and productions, but at one time almost came close to trying to produce it at the theater. It didn't work out, but I really wished we'd done that.
Considering some of the productions that you did bring that I think possibly would have been passed by other people, I think you guys did a great job, because I cannot imagine Hair being produced anywhere else.
Well, certainly in its original form, with its original cast of characters or people who were in charge of it, it was so stormy and dysfunctional in its development and its rehearsals. I don't know what other producing organization could have seen it through that particular stage back then. But Joe was very adept at doing it. He got very down to earth, straightforward, in dealing with an hysterical and dysfunctional situation, which was certainly a part of the story of the development of Hair and its rehearsal. And he didn't pick up on the hysteria of a situation. He picked up on what he could do to solve the problem. And then he would go about it in this very interesting way that I got used to, which was like someone, laying bricks and trying to get the mortar spread evenly, just very businesslike, straightforward, without any other kind of considerations. He would just address himself to nitty-gritty problems with a practical idea and not pick up on the hysterical business that was going on all around him from various people. So he was very good at that. And I saw that go into operation many times. He was like that when he had his early situation with Hair, trying to get it put on the stage in some form that hadn't collapsed before its first preview. And he did succeed in that, but it was really crazier than I can possibly describe or even described in the book. Getting there, I really thought at one point it was just never going to be able to open because it was too crazy. I thought everybody would start yelling at each other off script on stage during the show. I didn't know what the heck was going to happen, but that didn't happen, thank God. And it was just such a new sound, the sound of rock in the theater. I have no idea how that hit people's heads and ears. They just never heard it before. It was a different sound of Broadway type musicals. Many of them very, very fine with wonderful songs, but nothing like a rock song ever. Mm-hmm. So when people heard rock music and rock songs along with revolutionary sounding lyrics for the first time in the theater at our place, they just couldn't believe it. They went really crazy about it, especially younger people. They started storming the box office for tickets. And Joe, who didn't know until pretty late what he was going to open with when we opened the theater in 1967, suddenly found he had this hit musical on his hands. And it was the first time he'd ever sold tickets in his life. They were very cheap. They were $2.50, but he'd never sold tickets, only given tickets away in the parks. So this was his first time selling tickets. And it was truly amazing experience to see people barnstorming our ticket office down at the public theater in the way that people had been lining up by the hundreds to get their free tickets up there in the parks. So it was an amazing kind of experience to live through. Joe was worried what his philosophy of theater was exactly now that he was selling tickets. What's my relationship with the audience now that I'm selling tickets? Even though it was a nonprofit organization, and even if he sold out every single theater, there were eventually 5 theaters built in the building that we occupied. Even if he sold every single theater out, the biggest theater was 200 seats, 299 seats, and down to 99 seats. So you could never make money on that basis. It was no business model of any kind whatsoever. It was a crazy gamble that he took. That was part of the thing that Joe was willing to do, was to take enormous risks without necessarily having any solution in sight to them.
That must have been really incredible, though. I mean, he had to have a lot of just faith in his own ability to figure it out.
Well, I think he had that to some extent. But in terms of how you make money in a theatrical complex of tiny theaters compared to Broadway, say, I don't know. The only way you can figure that out is to be able to raise enough money, maybe even hopefully in a future endowment, so that you have some cushion and basis to do a season. Otherwise, you set yourself up simply to lose money. And unless you can lose money from some other stipend or investment, or you could just raise the money constantly to stave off being out of money entirely, it's just not a business model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he engaged with that strange kind of aspect that the theater was founded on. He never solved it. The only solution was to raise the money.
What was it like whenever the two of you are married and living together and working together? Did you ever have a problem with business and personal lives clashing?
We really didn't. We were just, for one thing, we were very compatible. We really got along very, very well. We were both devoted to the same cause, let me put it that way, in the public theater. And Joe was very supportive of my work. I did really good work in my new capacity as it evolved of developing new works and musicals also for the public theater. If I hadn't been able to do that, I don't know where we might have landed in our working relationship, but I was able to do that. We complemented each other's professional goals in that respect. Joe once said there was really very little division between our personal and professional lives, which was true. But we did have personal lives. Joe's youngest son, he was 12 years old, he came to live with us, chose to live with his father. So I partly brought up his younger son, whom I was greatly devoted, just loved him dearly. And he had other children from other previous marriages, with all of whom I have relationships with to this very day. I have 3 remaining stepdaughters and 1 remaining stepson. So I feel blessed in those relationships. I didn't bring those other children up, but I've had very fine relationships with them. And I feel blessed by having those stepchildren in my life. I didn't bring any stepchildren into Joe's life because I didn't have children. But we found a way to deal with my youngest stepson's difficulties at one point. And we were both devoted to him. Joe loved his son very dearly, and we lost to AIDS when he was a young man, very talented designer of artware, which is art that you wear.
Yeah.
He was immensely gifted, a craftsman. We were both devastated by the loss of my stepson, Tony. I'm still in touch with Tony's older sister and two of his older daughters. They all live in different states. So Colorado, Florida, Maryland, you name it.
Oh, wow. Well spread out.
All spread out, right. But I have very cordial relationships. So that was part of our family fabric, apart from the work considerations, and also the observation of certain things that we observed each year, such as Hanukkah and the Seders that we had at home. So there was a personal aspect that was distinct from the theater, but it seemed, I think, I have to say honestly, for the younger kids, my stepson and his sister, I think it was a challenge and a problem for them to have a father who was so preoccupied, let me say, with his role in the theater and in founding new theaters and so forth, that they felt they didn't get enough of him in their childhoods. Mm-hmm. I understand that entirely. And I think that was true. They just didn't get enough of him. And they regretted it and had strong feelings about that sense of deprivation. But Joe certainly loved his children. He took care of them. And I think as one or two of them grew older, they were able to get beyond some of that early feeling of deprivation from their respective mothers and their divorces from Joe, because he was married 3 or 4 times. So he had a checkered marital background. And by the time I entered the scene, I didn't have anything to match that exactly. I'd been married twice before, but nothing rivaled Joe's checkered career. But we both went about improving ourselves with respect to our personal relationships through therapy when we were younger. Joe pursued it for many years. I pursued it on my own, totally apart from him before I ever met him for many years. So I think we both had a very acute personal awareness of the psychological aspects of our lives that were totally private and separate from work. And we had both tried to be better people as a result of those efforts with our therapies. I'll have to say that quite honestly. I certainly did. And I knew that Joe had too. So
I'm a big fan of therapy. I always recommend it to people. Yeah. After a big breakup, I went to therapy for a while to just kind of clean up baggage from my relationship. Yeah. And then I met my husband. So
oh my gosh.
I think it was perfect timing. It was what I needed to have a good relationship.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. Yeah, self-awareness is incredibly useful. Mm-hmm. Because I don't know how you can really negotiate your way in your life unless you have some self-awareness. Yeah. And sometimes it doesn't come easily. And you have to change your idea about yourself a little bit to know how you interact with other people, whether it's relatives, stepchildren, or parents, or whatever it might be. You have to understand your effect upon them and how you manage it. I think we both underwent our very separate discoveries in that department because there was no particular relationship between his therapy and my therapy. They happened in different eras of our lives, but I think they were very useful.
Think that could be why the relationship with you lasted longer than the others?
Well, his relationship with me lasted almost 2 decades or more, which was slightly longer than one of his marriages. His early marriages hardly lasted any time at all. He was 19 when he got married for the first time. Well, so was I when I got married for the first time. And so that's awful young to know what the heck you're doing. But he certainly learned and he changed his ways considerably. And I did the same since the time I was a young girl. So those are separate stories entirely. I could write a book about mine, but I didn't. I left all that stuff out of my book. I briefly refer to it a little bit.
Now, with so many books that have been written about Joe Papp and his career, do you think the full vision of him has been presented now with your edition?
Well, I don't want to make outrageous claims for myself. I do think that since it's a close-up of Joe, whereas the other 2 books are not close-ups, although both the writers knew Joe,
Mm-hmm.
Mine is a close-up out of a personal relationship. It's possible to grasp more aspects of him than some of their accounts might offer. But I don't want to denigrate them in any way whatsoever, because I think they're both very valuable books that are worth reading and interesting also. I think they complement each other. But I felt it was important for me to write the book for various reasons that I've just tried to present to you. And also, just quite frankly, because I miss Joe, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a way of keeping my life with him present in trying to write a book about our life together. That's been very rewarding to me, just in and of itself. I've also enjoyed developing myself as a writer, although I wrote various things in the course of my jobs and so forth. I never thought of myself as a writer, and I never thought I would try to tackle a book. There was a lot of self-doubt about that particular enterprise that I foisted on myself along the way. I thought, oh my God, what am I doing?
Well, I can tell you, as somebody who has read your book, you are a very good writer. The book is captivating from beginning to end.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think I've had a lot of good help, with an excellent editor, but it wasn't easy.
Oh, I can imagine. There's so much in this book to unpack. I mean, I can't even imagine how you put this all together, because it is just incredible. There's so much.
I can't either. I don't know how I did it. I just kept at it. I really and truly wanted to do it. I didn't know how to do it exactly, but I just kept at it. And I learned as I went. I certainly have enough examples to follow, because both my parents are very good writers. And I can tell good writing when I see or hear it. So actually, it was very useful to me. This might be interesting for other writers. Every time I wrote part of a chapter, I would immediately get out my little Olympus hand recorder,
Mm-hmm.
and I would speak the words into this thing and play them back to me. And this is where my ear would take over. Having grown up with radio, I'd listen to my own voice, such as it was, narrating a certain section of a chapter. I thought, oh, that doesn't sound right. Oh, that's not the right word. That sentence doesn't really hang together very well at all. It sounds awkward as heck. So then I would rewrite based on what my ear told me.
That is so cool that you do that, because I always load up my books into a program that reads them to me. And I'm always telling people when they edit to do that, to load it up into something that will read it to you so you can listen to the words, because you catch things that way that you never catch while reading it.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know there was such a program, so I just recorded my own voice. But yeah, I find that it to be absolutely true. Your ear really can catch it, because you know when something's being spoken to you, whether it sounds right or not,
Mm-hmm. It's amazing, the difference.
Yes, it really is. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it sure is. The way I experienced that. So that was immensely useful to me. When I got onto it, I thought, oh my God, I better read this thing to myself before I even go on to the next chapter or the next paragraph. I didn't want to make a move without that process that my ears would tell me what to fix. Even with all that, I still could use the expertise of an editor, and I had an excellent agent who was also an editor. That was just enormously helpful. Everything he pointed out to me was absolutely right on and immensely helpful.
That's one thing that I also stress with people. It's like, don't skimp on an editor. You can skip on everything else. But if you really want to be taken seriously as a published author, whether you're indie or hybrid or going traditional, get a good editor.
You're absolutely right. It really is important. And how you find one and where that person comes from is, something one has to discover. There are freelance editors, and I got the services of several of them, which I paid for, of course, along the way. I also enrolled in a course in memoir writing here in New York City, 2 semesters of it. They were very useful because you're in a class with other writers writing memoirs. And when you read a part of your chapter out loud, your fellow writers have a lot of questions to ask about what it means and so forth and so on. So that was very good, because you've got an audience and you've got their reaction. That's very, very useful, and also enjoyed it. So I went through many different phases of the editing process. Freelance editors, people called developmental editors, which could engage and so forth. certain readers. There was readers on a writer's magazine where you could submit something, you get a feedback. I did that. About 7 different aspects of this editing process before I ever even sent it to my agent, who was also an editor. So it went through a lot of vetting, let me say, that was most useful and from which I had really learned a great deal.
Well, the work that went into it definitely comes through whenever you read it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so kind of you to say that. I really appreciate it.
Now, this is the point of the show that we always like to do 5 quick questions that never turn out to be quick, but we like to do it anyway just because it's fun.
Okay, all right.
Okay, question 1. Have you gotten over your fear of flying?
Oh no, I haven't flown for years, especially with the recent report. It was yesterday's newspaper about the lack of control tower personnel these days. Well, okay, that's just another good reason for me not to fly.
Yeah.
I don't fly. Unfortunately, I don't have any reason to fly anywhere, although I do dream about traveling, but it's difficult at my age to travel. And I certainly can't travel by myself, really. And although I have a wonderful daughter-in-law who lives with me, we haven't developed any traveling plans to date. So I think maybe my traveling days are over anyhow. So the answer to that question is no, I never got over that. I never got over the fear of flying.
I can understand that. I mean, I'm in my mid-50s and my husband and I just went back to Kansas from Germany where we live for Thanksgiving. And
really?
That was about 20 hours of travel and I still feel it. So question 2.
Yeah.
Do you still study, let me see if I can say this right, malacology?
Malacology. Well, I'm just a self-appointed collector of seashells. Malacology is all about seashells, their behavior and so forth. I don't study it anymore, but I still have my wonderful seashell collection. And I still remember a little bit about the behaviors, fascinated me at one time about seashells, where they come from and so forth and so on. And also just their beauty or their exotic looks. Some of them look like skeletons almost. They're very strange looking. And others are beautifully enameled and polished or had beautiful reticulated surfaces or look like disappearing domes, architectural creations. They're amazing variety that's always intrigued me. But this is purely a collector's hobby on my part at one phase of my life. But I still have them.
That's very cool. Question 3. What is the favorite production that you have ever worked on?
Oh, my.
I'm sure there's a long list to choose from.
Well, I can't say favorite because I can't name a favorite, amongst all things.
I think that would be very hard.
The most intense one, let me put it that way, would be certainly The Normal Heart, Larry Kramer's play about the AIDS crisis in New York City in 1985. I had, I think, the closest relationship to a writer on that one that I had, and its importance in future, although delayed success in New York City, was really instrumental in my life, I think, and I value it enormously. It was a interesting reciprocal connection that Larry Kramer and I had because Larry was famous for being an impossible person. He was so outraged by the neglect of the AIDS crisis in the 80s that he just sounded off in very strong language against everybody that he felt was in opposition to providing enough help. And so I had heard about this behavior of his, which was certainly confrontational and angry, but I never had that relationship with him. We always got along just fine. So go figure. I don't know exactly why, but we did. And that lasted until the day he died.
That's amazing.
And it was very, very fulfilling kind of feeling to have to an author, a playwright.
And to be a part of something that was so important at that time period in history.
It really was. And the play took on this interesting life post-AIDS, where some people saw it as really redefining what being gay meant in our culture and our society. This from people who were active in gay rights, still are. They felt there was an important redefinition of how you see yourself in a society and how you define yourself. So they felt that was part of its lasting benefit, aside from its immediate tackling of a gross negligence of a huge disease problem in the city and then in the country on the part of all levels of government, city, state, and federal at that time, that just were not dealing with it. They weren't even mentioning it.
Yeah.
So I remember being appalled myself by it. But aside from that, there was this other kind of broader cultural aspect, development of an appreciation of the role of gay people, gay men in our society, that certainly has a very lasting aspect to it that I think you'll find other gay playwrights will readily cite. People like Tony Kushner and others readily cite the tradition they inherited from Larry Kramer and his work in that play. So I feel very good about that.
That has to be just amazing to have been a part of that.
Yeah, it really is.
Question 4. Why do you prefer W.C. Fields over Charlie Chaplin?
Oh, dear. Well, let's see. I don't know. That was an early preference. I don't know that I necessarily have that now, but back then, he made me laugh more. That's the only reason. And some of it was like his absolutely heedless and unsentimental approach to certain things.
That's a good way to put it.
His disdain for little children, even in his films, which is like absolutely a god-awful thing. Because you should always treat little children in a kindly and benevolent way and so forth. And he didn't do that. Some of that seemed very amusing to me back then. I haven't watched his films in recent years, so I don't know. I admire Charlie Chaplin immensely because of his incredible skill. They're just two very different kinds of people. But back then, I was a little younger, of course, than I am now. And I was willing to cite my preferences in a more boldly and unconsidered way. And Joe sort of felt the same, I think, about those things back then.
I just found it really interesting because I was actually just discussing this with a friend of mine when we were back in Wichita. A friend of mine is a movie historian.
Oh.
And he specializes in the silent era and early talkie movies. And we were talking about Charlie Chaplin because he does my absolute favorite movie monologue in The Great Dictator. And I almost weep watching this thing every time. And so, but I mean, it's obviously not part of his comedic stuff. This is a very serious monologue that he does. And it was just incredible. So that's why I really wanted to find out the difference in W.C. Fields, because I love W.C. Fields too. He was hilarious. But yeah, Charlie Chaplin still has a special place for me.
Yeah, well, he certainly has a special place. There's no question about it.
So question 5, what is your favorite holiday tradition?
Oh my, well, let's see.
And it can be any holiday.
Any holiday. Well, I'll rule out Thanksgiving. I will rule out Christmas. I don't observe Christmas. I like Hanukkah, which is coming up soon. I enjoy lighting the menorah and saying a prayer. It's not a big family occasion the way Thanksgiving and Christmas are, but I do enjoy it. I enjoyed the seders Joe and I used to have. I enjoyed the whole ritual, which I describe a little bit in the book. Although I'm not Jewish myself, I'm certainly acculturated to a Jewish-influenced identity because my entire adult life, since the age of 19, my last name has been Jewish. And I've been in the bosom of Jewish families, of in-laws. So I wasn't brought up religious. I certainly wasn't brought up Christian. So I identify very strongly, I think, with the Jewish traditions of Hanukkah and the Seder, Passover.
You have a very strong connection just through who performed your marriage ceremony.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it was a marvelous man who was one of the people that defended Joe's free admission in Central Park before the state Supreme Court. And he later became a judge on that court. And he was also very involved in representing Leo Frank, the father of Anne Frank, when that father was being sued in a grievous way for a period of years. So he was very steeped in that situation with a Jewish cause and client, and was very, very sensitive to it. A marvelous man, very warm and wonderful person. And Joe, since he really saved Joe's ability to perform in Central Park in his suit against Robert Moses when he was banned from the park, Joe had invited him to perform our marriage ceremony here in our living room, where I'm talking from now. And I thought this is just a wonderful thing to do because he was the perfect person for both of us to do that.
That's
And
incredible.
yeah, it was just wonderful, wonderful kind of thing.
Now, we have been asking a bonus question with the holidays coming up. There's so many gift-giving holidays that we've been asking our authors to suggest a gift other than your own book. For you, I would ask for somebody who is a theater fan. What would be a good gift?
A good gift for a theater fan?
Mhm.
Well, I would think, many theaters are offering holiday gift ideas now. I can find them on their online presences. I would select a theater that you could buy some gifts from, like some of them offer cups or they offer T-shirts or, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But buy some stuff from the theater because the sales of it will go to supporting that theater. And I think that's a wonderful kind of gift where if you're a theater fan, you can help the theater through the kind of gift you give at Christmas. I think that would be a good thing to do.
Does the public theater have souvenirs?
Oh, yeah. Sure. All theaters do. Yeah.
Now, what is next for you? Do you have any projects coming up?
Well, yes, the project I have right now, immediate one, is to continue to make people aware of my book and so forth, whatever that takes. And then I'm going to be conducting a course, seminar, I should call it, at City College in February. And I am thinking about my next book, which might be something about my life growing up as a child at the end of the Depression and through the World War II years, what it was like growing up on the West Coast at that time. I'm kind of interested in the consciousness one has as a child of the world that you live in. So I'm trying to revisit that a bit and see if I can coax a book out of it.
And if you do, please come back and talk to us about it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's very nice talking to you. I really appreciate it.
Now, is there anything that you feel that we have not covered that people need to know about you?
I don't think so. I really think that we've covered just about all the important points that I would want to make about the book and about myself. I was concerned in writing the book that I might get some kind of blowback from people who automatically reject what a married partner who's female, in other words, a wife, could write about her husband that wouldn't be so compromised by a prejudice in favor of her husband or mate or partner that the book should be automatically out of hand dismissed as not worthy to read or to pay attention to or give any credence to. I haven't really encountered that so far. And I'm pleased, but I tried somehow to expect that. I just got a little taste of it on one thing online, but not too much, because I think there is a predisposition to automatically discount what a wife or a partner can say about her husband. And I think that's a god-awful prejudice. It's really terrible. I think wives, unless they're operating out of, retribution or something, often and generally have a larger and more comprehensive and balanced, often, a view of their spouse that other people can have. So I think there's a value in that. And you have to assume also that a spouse writing such a book is not a mentally deficient person, but maybe a fully rational, reasoning, fully informed and backgrounded adult worthy of some consideration. So I think maybe that has taken hold a little bit here and there, and I'm very pleased to encounter it.
Well, I would think anybody who had that kind of an opinion obviously hadn't read the book, because if they read it, that impression would not come across at all.
Oh, thank you so much.
Where can people find your book?
Well, they can get it online. It's Barnes & Noble online. It's also at Amazon online. And they can go to my website if they want, which is gailpapp.com. And there's a book page there that where you can order it from the book page. So there are a lot of online places that you can get it from.
And the links to all of those places will be in the description of this podcast. And it's also in our Book Banter Magazine Year-End Buying Guide on the page that talks about your book, and in our December issue where we have a short article about you as well.
Oh, thank you so much. It's wonderful to know.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me. I was actually a little bit nervous. I don't get nervous about interviews because I used to be an entertainment reporter a long, long, long time ago. But there was just so much about this book that I really wanted to discuss with you. I was afraid that we were not going to have the time to really bring a good vision of it to the audience, but I think we did a great job.
So thanks to your questions, which were very generous and inviting. It's also a pleasure to talk to you. It's not a stressful situation whatsoever.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. That's one of the things that I always try and strive for, is to make these nice, comfortable conversations.
Yeah, well, you certainly do that. You have a marvelous gift for it. And I thank you very much for that, because I'm not used to being interviewed. And it's the first time in my life, in my late 80s, that I'm engaged in it. So I appreciate that very, very much.
Wow, you did a fantastic job.
So it's a pleasure to talk to you. And I love what you're doing. I think it's so important.
Thank you. So there you have it, my happy people. My final interview for season 2 of Book Banter with Diane Burkhart in 2023 with Gail Merrifield Papp, discussing her book, Private Public, My Life with Joe Papp at the Public Theater. She was just absolutely phenomenal. We spoke for about another hour after we ended the recording, and she was just so gracious and so wonderful. Her book is fantastic. It is so well written. If you have any interest in how theater can affect social change and can be important to community, please check this book out. You will be amazed at the things that have probably touched your life because of what they were doing in New York City at the Public Theater that you never realized was actually a part of your growing up. It was an eye-opener for me. I was absolutely fascinated. It's so good. I highly recommend it for yourself or as a gift for someone you know is interested in this sort of thing. Going forward now, we are going to be on hiatus until February 7th. That is the first Wednesday in February, when we begin season 3 of Book Banter with Diane Burkhart. We're going to have an entire month of Love Fest, of course, for February. It'll be really interesting, and we're also going to be doing a lot with our companion magazine, Book Banter Magazine. Now, during the hiatus, we will be having our 100th episode, and we will be coming back for a new show on January 10th with a very special guest. And if you've been following along with my author career and when I started writing as Stephen Burkhart back in 2015, you have actually heard a lot about this person, but you may not have realized who they actually were. And I'm going to introduce them to you in person on the show January 10th. Be sure to tune in. If you have been catching a show every once in a while, but not catching all of them, please go subscribe. You can find us at burkhartbooks.com/podcast. You can also follow us on our podcast hosting site, bookbanter.buzzsprout.com, or just search Book Banter with Diane Burkhart on most of your major podcast streaming services. You can find us pretty much anywhere. I just want to tell you all, no matter what holiday you are celebrating right now, because there are so many at this time of year, I hope that you all have a wonderful holiday season, that you and your family are all happy and healthy and enjoying your time together and reading some very good books. And with a little hope, maybe one or two of them are mine. You can find my books at burkhartbooks.com/books. They're available in paperback, hardcover, ebook, and hopefully we will be getting around to finishing out all of the books in audiobooks very soon. Thank you so much for joining me this season. It has been amazing. I have loved every interview I have done. There have been such incredible authors I've gotten to meet, and a few of them I've actually become good friends with, and I value their input and advice. I have grown so much as an author myself this year because of all of them, and I hope you have found everything to be just as beneficial for you. And for the readers out there, I hope you have found some fantastic new authors to read, because I do my best to try and make sure that we have a wide variety of genres and that every author that we bring to you puts out good quality, entertaining work that you are going to love. If you have suggestions for authors you would like to be on the show, please feel free to drop us an email at burkhartbooks.com. If you go to the bottom of any page on there, there are links to send us an email. We would love to hear who you would like to have me do an interview with. If you're an author, please feel free to drop your own name and let us know that you want to be a part of this show. But for now, it's time for us to say goodbye for the next few weeks, and we will see you again on February 7th. Have a wonderful holiday season, people. Now it's time for you all to go forth and be very, very happy that we're going to have a lot more coming for you in 2024.